Imagine this. It's late on a damp October night in 1960s Yorkshire. The town of Pontefract is quiet. The streets hushed under a blanket of drizzle. But inside one ordinary-looking council house at 30 East Drive, something unnatural is stirring. The Pritchard family, like many working-class households of that era, lived a modest life. Jean and Joe, their teenage son Philip, and their daughter Diana were unremarkable in every sense. Their semi-detached home looked like any other on the estate. Neat front garden, small brick wall, net curtains in the windows. Nothing about the place suggested it might become the site of one of Britain's most infamous hauntings. But soon, the Pritchards would find themselves living not just with each other, but with something else. Something unseen, something violent, something that would become known as the Black Monk of Pontefract. It began innocuously enough, as these things often do. Cold gust of air sweeping through a closed room, strange pools of water forming on the linoleum floor, with no signs of a leak. Lights flickering, doors slamming, small disturbances that might easily be shrugged off. The kind of things you tell yourself have rational explanations, even as the hair on your arm stands on end. But the disturbances didn't stop. They grew bolder, sharper, more sinister. Objects hurled themselves across the room with invisible force. Family photos were torn from the walls. Cupboards rattled violently. Even heavy furniture, wardrobes and beds shifted as though weightless. And then the Pritchards began to see it. A dark figure, robed like a monk, its face hidden beneath a black cowl. It would appear silently at the edge of vision, watching, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes by the beds of the children as they slept. The family had no words for it at first, no frame of reference for the terror that crept into their once ordinary home. But soon the neighbours would know. The local priest would know. Even paranormal investigators would come from across Britain to see for themselves. This was no mild haunting, no flicker of a candle flame or whisper in the night. This was violent, physical, relentless. And for more than a decade, 30 East Drive would be tormented by what many still call Britain's most violent poltergeist. But what exactly happened inside that house? Was the Black Monk a restless spirit tied to Pontefract's bloody medieval past? A trick of psychology, or was it something far darker? Something that thrived on fear and refused to be banished? Tonight, we're going to step inside 30 East Drive and relive the chilling events that unfolded there. But be warned, this isn't just a ghost story. It's a record of real testimony, real suffering, and a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast, where we explore the darkest parts of human history. I hope everybody is well. I'm Rob, your host as always, and today you're joining me for our Halloween special. A story that's as chilling as it is unsettling. Halloween is often a time for campfire tales, ghost stories whispered in the dark, and the thrill of being a little bit frightened. But tonight's story isn't drawn from fiction. It isn't a product of a gothic novelist or horror film script. This is history. Modern history at that. Testimonies, reports, and a trail of strange, violent events tied to one very ordinary house in Yorkshire. We like to think of hauntings as something old, something tied to crumbling castles, decaying manors, or remote graveyards. But what makes this case so unnerving is how ordinary it all looks from the outside. A council house, a working class family. Nothing that screams horror or mystery. Yet behind that front door, something unexplainable unfolded. Something that transformed an unremarkable home into Britain's most infamous site for supernatural violence. You might have heard of it before. 30 East Drive, Pontefract. Over the years, it's become a place of legend among paranormal investigators. Even now, people travel from across the country to step inside and see if they can sense what the Pritchards lived with. Some leave shaken, swearing they've felt a presence. Others scoff, convinced it's nothing but overactive imaginations. But the fact remains, over a decade, the Pritchard family and countless visitors experienced something they could never explain, and often wished they had never encountered. Now, I should say this, whether you believe in ghosts or not, the details of this haunting are enough to unsettle anybody. We're not talking about rattling chains or harmless bumps in the night. We're talking about physical attacks. We're talking about forces so violent it left bruises, dragged people from their beds, and threw objects across the room with inhumane strength. And what makes this story even darker are the theories about what the entity really was. Some say it was the spirit of a 16th century monk executed nearby. Others argue it was never human at all, but something far worse. A demonic force. A parasite that latched onto the family and fed on their fears. So, on this Halloween night, pour yourself a drink, settle beside the fire, and let's step back into 1960s Yorkshire. Into a quiet little town, a perfectly ordinary street, and a house that hid darkness, and some more dark history. To understand the hauntings at 30 East Drive, you have to look beneath the bricks and mortar. On the surface, the estate where the Pritchards live was nothing unusual. Rows of post-war council houses, built in the 1950s and 60s, to meet Britain's demand for affordable homes. But the ground they were built on carries a much older, bloodier history. Pontefract itself is a town steeped in violence. Its very name derived from the Latin pontus fractus, meaning broken bridge, a reference to its medieval origins. By the 1600s, Pontefract was already notorious, not for hauntings but for executions, uprisings, and the looming shadow of its castle. The castle had long been a stronghold for power. It was here in 1649 that Charles I's ally, Colonel John Morris, was executed after the English Civil War. The town had been a royalist stronghold, besieged 3 times by parliamentarian forces. Each siege left the population starving, disease-ridden, and brutalised by conflict. By the time Cromwell ordered the castle demolished, the ground beneath Pontefract had already soaked up centuries of blood. And then there are the darker tales. Local tradition holds that during the 16th century, a monk from the nearby priory was executed for crimes so heinous they were said to stain his soul. Different versions of the story exist. Some claim he was a murderer, others whisper of darker sins. Whatever the truth, the figure of the Black Monk entered local folklore as a restless spirit bound to the land by violence and shame. By the 1600s and 1700s, Pontefract had gained another grim reputation. Public executions were carried out on gallows not far from the town centre. Criminals, dissenters, and rebels alike were hanged, their bodies left on display as a warning. It was not uncommon for burial pits to be dug hastily nearby. Mass graves, unmarked, absorbed the unwanted dead. Fast forward to the 20th century, when new housing estates were laid across this same land. In the 1950s and 60s, as Britain rebuilt itself after the Second World War, old fields, forgotten burial grounds, and the fringes of the castle's former holdings were levelled and covered with rows of brick homes. The past wasn't erased, it was just buried. And that brings us back to 30 East Drive. The very place where the Pritchard's house stood was rumoured to be near, if not directly over, one of these old execution sites. Some claim that the monk's body was buried nearby, the earth holding his restless spirit. Others argue that it wasn't a monk at all, but the collective trauma of centuries of bloodshed seeping into the soil. A psychic scar that would erupt with violence once families began living on top of it. So when the Pritchards moved into their new home in the 1960s, they were stepping not just into a modern council house, but onto ground layered with centuries of death, conflict, and punishment. And if the stories are true, that history found its way back to the surface. The first sign that something wasn't right at 30 East Drive came in the summer of 1966. The Pritchards had only recently moved into their new home. Jean and Joe were away on holiday, leaving their teenage son Philip in the care of his grandmother, Sarah. It was an ordinary evening when it started. Sarah noticed what looked like chalky white powder falling in mid-air in the living room, drifting down like snow. It wasn't coming from the ceiling. It wasn't plaster dust, and there was no workman nearby. It was simply there, materializing in the middle of the room. A few hours later, pools of water began to appear across the kitchen floor. Large, clear puddles, as though someone had tipped out a bucket. But when they tried to mop them up, the water reappeared again, in the same place, as though the house itself was bleeding moisture. Then came the bangs, loud, hollow, percussive knocks that echoed through the walls and ceilings. Doors slamming shut with such force they rattled their frames. Cupboards shaking violently, their contents spilling across the floor. Objects began to move of their own accord. A clock was hurled across the room. Ornaments flew from shelves and smashed against the walls. When Jean and Joe returned from their holiday, they were greeted by a house in chaos, and two relatives who swore the place was haunted. At first they laughed it off, a family prank perhaps, a neighbour's child playing tricks, but the activity continued, and soon it was impossible to deny. The disturbances escalated, growing more aggressive. A heavy chest of drawers, which took two men to lift, was dragged across the floor by unseen forces. Curtains were ripped from their rails. Entire beds shook violently in the middle of the night, jolting the children awake. But it was their daughter Diane who seemed to bear the brunt of the violence. She was just 12 years old when it started, and the entity, whatever it was, appeared to fixate on her. She was slapped across the face by an invisible hand, leaving an angry red mark. Her hair was pulled. On one occasion, she was dragged up the stairs by her throat, kicking and screaming, while the rest of the family watched in helpless horror. The neighbours heard the commotion. Some were sceptical, dismissed it as hysteria. Others, out of curiosity, came inside, only to leave shaken, insisting they had two witnessed objects moving without explanation. Even the Pritchard's priest was called in. He performed a blessing and prayers, walking room to room with holy water. But rather than subduing the activity, it seemed to provoke it further. Loud crashes reverberated through the walls, crucifixes were torn down and flung across the room. At one point, a jug of milk levitated from the kitchen table and emptied itself across the priest's robes. He left the house pale and shaken, muttering that it was no ordinary haunting. The entity's presence became unmistakable. The family began seeing it, a dark hooded figure standing silently in the corner of rooms, always in the periphery, never showing its face. Its robes were black, heavy and archaic, like those of a medieval monk. From then on they called it Fred. It was a name chosen almost in jest, a way to make the terror feel less overwhelming. But Fred, the Black Monk, was anything but harmless. For more than a decade, the violence continued. Witnesses described Diane being thrown from her bed, dragged across rooms and pinned to the floor by unseen hands. Neighbours swore they saw lights flickering violently whenever they walked past the house. Visitors reported being scratched, pushed and even choked. And all the while, the shadow of the monk appeared again and again, sometimes at the foot of Diane's bed, sometimes in the hallway, blocking the stairs, sometimes outside watching from the garden gate, always silent, always watching. The violence reached such extremes that at one point, Diane was nearly strangled with an electrical cord. Another night, she was lifted several feet into the air and hurled onto her bedroom floor. The family tried priests, mediums, paranormal investigators, anyone who might help, but nothing worked. The presence remained, feeding on fear, growing stronger and stronger. 30 East Drive had become something no family home would ever be. A place of terror. After more than a decade of terror, the Pritchard family finally left 30 East Drive behind. By then, their story had already circulated widely. People in Pontefract spoke of a strange house on the estate, the one with the bangs in the night, and a daughter who seemed to be thrown about by invisible hands. For the family, leaving was an escape. For the town, it was the beginning of a legend. The house did not fall quiet. Later tenants came and went. Some dismissed the stories, others leaving abruptly, unwilling to stay where an atmosphere of unease lingered. Over time, word spread beyond Pontefract, and the house became a point of fascination for paranormal investigators. Groups began entering the property in the 70s and 80s, each hoping to capture proof of what the Pritchards had endured. Many came away shaken, batteries drained inexplicably, cameras refusing to function inside certain rooms. Photographs taken in otherwise empty hallways revealed shadowy forms, shapes that resembled a cloaked figure with its head bowed. Audio equipment recorded knocks, growls and muffled voices that hadn't been heard during the time of recording. Some investigators came to experience direct physical interference. One was shoved violently against a wall in the upstairs landing. Another described a hand gripping his wrist so tightly he still bore the red mark after leaving. A small number reported waking in the middle of the night to see a dark robed silhouette at the foot of their bed, unmoving and silent. Priests and mediums had long tried to intervene. Blessings and prayers were read, and on one occasion a full exorcism was attempted. The effect was short-lived. The disturbances subsided briefly, then returned with greater ferocity, as though resistance only strengthened whatever was inside. This is a common theme with poltergeist cases, but the sheer violence reported at 30 East Drive set it apart. Sceptics, of course, put forward explanations. They argued that the events were exaggerated or fabricated, fueled by hysteria, faulty memories, and the human tendency to see patterns in the unexplained. Some pointed to the possibility of an underground water channel beneath the estate, which could produce strange noises, vibrations, or even damp patches on the floor. Others suggested that the Pritchards' experiences were psychosomatic, stress manifesting as imaged phenomena. Yet this fails to explain the physical injuries observed by multiple witnesses, or the reports of those who had no prior knowledge of the haunting. Too many people unconnected to each other described the same hooded figure, the same oppressive atmosphere, the same sense of being watched. Local historians added fuel to the debate by pointing out that executions had once taken place near the estate, including those of monks during the dissolution of the monasteries. Some believe that the Black Monk was one such figure, condemned and buried nearby, his restless spirit bound to the soil beneath the modern houses. Others dismiss this entirely, arguing that the presence was not human at all, but something darker, a malevolent force that simply took on the form of a monk because it inspired fear. By the early 2000s, 30 East Drive had become a fixture of paranormal tourism. Investigators rented it out for overnight vigils, some left with nothing more than stories of a creaky old house. Others departed convinced they had come face to face with something unexplained. The house became known as the most violent haunting in Britain, its reputation cemented by decades of testimony and a trail of unexplained evidence. What makes the Black Monk case so disturbing is that it resists easy dismissal. It is neither a quaint ghost story nor a single unexplained incident. It's a catalogue of terror spanning years, backed by photography, audio recordings, witness accounts, and a family who lived through the events no one would choose to invent. Theories abound, but certainty has never been reached. What remains, all these years later, is the same unsettling truth. 30 East Drive, an ordinary council house in Pontefract, continues to draw those curious enough, or reckless enough, to step inside. And more often than not, they leave convinced that something still waits within its walls. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this spooky episode of Dark History. Today, 30 East Drive stands as one of Britain's most notorious haunted houses. From the outside it looks ordinary. A brick council house, no different from its neighbours. Children play in the street, the gardens are modest, the curtains are plain. Yet to those who know its story, the house is a landmark of unease, a place where the mundane collides with the monstrous. The Black Monk has become a part of Pontefract folklore. For locals, it's a tale told in pubs and schools, half warning, half boast, as if the town carries with it a badge of dread. For the paranormal community, the house has become a proving ground. Books have been written, documentaries filmed, and horror movies loosely inspired by its story. Even hardened investigators describe the atmosphere inside as oppressive, a weight pressing down on every room. But what lingers the longest is not the fame of the house, but the question it leaves behind. Was the Pritchard family the victims of an elaborate trick of the mind? Hysteria, magnified over years? Or were they targeted by something truly violent? Something that cannot be explained by psychology or plumbing faults? Theories of restless monks and demonic forces sound medieval, yet the sheer scale of the testimony is hard to ignore. The Black Monk can expose the raw nerves of our relationship with the unseen. We are drawn to ghost stories because they press against the limits of what we believe to be real. An unexplained knock in the dark, the shadow of a figure where none should be. These are the things that unsettle us the most, because they don't fit neatly into reason. 30 East Drive is not just a story of fear. It's a reminder of how fragile our sense of certainty can be. And this is perhaps the true legacy of the Black Monk. Whether you believe in spirits or not, the events in Pontefract force us to confront the possibility that ordinary life can fracture without warning. A safe home can become a place of dread. A modern estate can sit on foundations of centuries-old violence. A family can be forced to share their space with something they cannot fight, cannot reason with, and cannot escape. In the end, the Black Monk of Pontefract is not simply a ghost story. It's a cautionary tale about history's weight on the present, about the unknown force that might lie just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. For the Pritchards, it was not folklore or entertainment, it was their reality. For those who visit 30 East Drive today, the same unsettling truth awaits. Some houses never truly empty themselves of the past. Anyway, if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us reach more listeners by boosting our visibility in the algorithm. If you think friends and family may enjoy the podcast, don't hesitate to share it with them. You'll find links to all socials below. I know ads can sometimes be a pain, so if you'd prefer ad-free episodes, check out our Patreon link also provided. Supporting us on Patreon is a great way to contribute, but it's entirely optional. We also have a merch store, link below, where any purchases greatly support the show and help cover production costs. If you've been listening for a while and haven't subscribed yet, please do so. In that way, you'll never miss an episode. Thank you for your support. So with all that out the way, please enjoy your Halloween night. Thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode, as we delve into another event and more dark history.